I'm Don Kinzler, the NDSU Extension Horticulture Agent for Cass County, and welcome to this evening's webinar on vegetable gardening. And this evening, I'm going to share 20 secrets to a more productive vegetable garden. It's going to cover kind of the basics, even if someone has never gardened before. We'll share some of the tips that make vegetable gardening just a success. And so let's get started. Again, welcome to all of those of you who joined. If you are new to the Zoom webinar type of programs, all of your cameras are automatically off and all of your microphones are automatically off also. If you have questions, we'll answer those questions at the end of the program. So feel free to put them in, preferably the Q&A, but also if you're more used to using the chat, you can put those in there as well, and I'll check both of them. Now, vegetable gardening is just absolutely amazing. I've been enjoying vegetable gardening since I was a little boy. When I was about 5 years old, my mom took me out into the vegetable garden. I was supposed to keep an eye on me, but I was so captivated by how things grew that I've been in the garden ever since. And of course, there are good reasons for growing our own vegetables. When you have a vegetable garden in your backyard or somewhere close by, you have easy, ready access to those fresh picked vegetables right from your garden to the table. And the other thing that I find is so fascinating, it's wonderful to watch these vegetables grow. For example, the potatoes there that I'm digging out of our own garden. Yeah, I know I can probably buy a bag of potatoes, probably very economically. Um, but buying a bag of potatoes at the grocery store isn't nearly as much fun as me going out to the garden in the fall of the year with the spading fork and digging up those potatoes to see what it is that we've got. Oh, and the taste of fresh homegrown potatoes is just awesome. So I know some of these things can be store bought, but there's lots of good reasons for growing your own. And of course, another good reason is to get young people involved in gardening. Because in my own case, my mom was a wonderful gardener. She was the gardener in the family, as were my grandfathers. And when you grow up with vegetable gardening, then you kind of learn the tricks, and then you can garden then when you're on your own. But also, for those of anyone that didn't grow up growing vegetables, we can all learn it. And, the other thing that's so fascinating is when we involve our kids with actually growing vegetables, there's been lots of studies done, and kids that grow their own vegetables eat more of them. It's kind of fun. The girl with the carrots there, isn't that fun? Gosh, carrots taste so good. Just young little carrots pulled up out of the garden, brush away the dirt and nibble on those. And so really, it does become just a lifelong pursuit. But, we're never too old to start. And so I always encourage anybody that maybe didn't grow up with gardening, well, now is a good time also. This is the vegetable garden that my wife Mary and I have in our South Fargo yard. Now, this was a few years ago. Not every year is as nice as that one was. This last year, because it was too wet early, and then it turned really dry and hot. So last year was probably one of the poorest vegetable gardens I ever had, but we still had food to eat, and I just didn't take photos of that one like I did of the previous years. Now, the nice thing is also we can garden in three ways. Okay, we can have the traditional in-ground vegetable garden, or we can also have a raised bed gardens. Now, these raised bed vegetable gardens have become very, very popular. As home lots get a little bit smaller, we can create a raised bed garden without even tilling up or getting rid of lawn or anything like that. And we'll talk about raised bed gardens in a minute. But a person can create a raised bed garden in a fairly small space. And with the technique that we're going to describe, you can get awesome production out of a raised bed garden. Oh, the other thing for apartment dwellers, anybody with a balcony, we can do container gardening. It's surprising the amount of vegetables that can be harvested growing them in pots. So even on a balcony, can you picture on, somebody that doesn't have a yard and is in an apartment? Imagine harvesting radishes and tomatoes and things like that off of a balcony. And we're going to talk about some tips on container gardening too. So when I talk about kind of 20 tips for getting better vegetable production, that's one of the 20 tips. And that is we can really garden in almost any way. Tip number two is to very carefully eye up the location in which you'd like to have your vegetable garden. Whether it's in ground, whether it's on a patio, or whether it's a raised bed garden, the location is really important. We need to focus on how much sunshine is being received in those areas. And um, the amount of sunshine is really critical as to what you can grow. Now, the preferred location is all day total sunshine out in the open so that the sunshine hits the vegetables all day long. That's the preferred. So if a person has that location somewhere in your yard or area or balcony, that's where to locate the garden, full sunshine. And that's kind of considered 6 to 8 hours of, all day sunshine, where the shade isn't going to kind of move around and block the vegetables. But some locations maybe only have part sun, part shade. That's considered kind of 4 to 6 hours of direct sunshine. So in the spring of the year, especially if you've got a new garden that you're planting, if you haven't gardened in that spot before, but you're kind of thinking about a new spot, kind of take a look, on one of your days off when you can kind of view the area throughout the day, kind of look to see exactly how much sun, does the sun move around and the area is shaded by the building or the house for part-time? Or if it's less than 4 hours of direct sunshine, then that's kind of considered shade. So even if you can't locate it in full sunshine, there are still some ways that we can garden in that. But if you have a choice, full all-day sunshine. Especially any vegetables that are produced and grow from flowers. Those need really full sunshine for best production. Okay, so we think of tomato, pepper, squash, cucumbers, melons. They all form a flower, and then the flower goes on to ripen into a fruit. And so to accomplish all that, from flower to fruit production, they really need full all-day sunshine. If it doesn't get that, then the production is diminished accordingly. So especially for those types of plants, vegetables, really full all-day sunshine is what's needed. Now, if you can't find all-day sunshine, if you have only maybe part sun, half day of sun, the if the edible portion is the root, those can go in half day sun, half day shade. Um, Such as carrots, radish, potatoes, onions, they don't require quite as much sunshine as the things that result from a flower. But what if the person is a balcony on the north side of a building and you just don't get sun? Well, maybe you get a little bit in the morning, a little bit late afternoon. But if your area is pretty much shaded, well, there are still some things you can do. Edible leaves. Edible leaves can be grown in almost full shade. Things like lettuce, spinach, kale, cabbage, any of the herbs, any of those types of vegetables would grow well in pots, even on the north side of a building. So anyway, if we don't have full sun, then we can kind of tailor what we grow and to still have good success. Now, if you're trying a location for the first time, the first year, well, maybe experiment with a little bit, even if it's not full sun, well, try tomatoes or peppers in that area and see if they do okay. If they're a little weaker, more spindly, you just don't get the production, it's likely that they aren't getting enough sunshine, and but sometimes a little bit of experimenting with vegetables. All right, the next step in gardening is deciding what to plant. Now, I like growing watermelons because they're fun, so I always want to make sure that we include watermelons and muskmelons. Now, my wife, Mary, and I aren't heavily into kale, and so we don't really plant much kale in our garden. So if you think about your family and what things they like to eat, what vegetables they prefer, and what you like, especially if space is limited, then concentrate, plant a little more of the things that you yourself like. So maybe make a plan. So when you go out to the garden center to buy the seeds, so that you kind of have a list, especially of the things that you like, and concentrate on those. The fourth step is to choose the vegetable varieties wisely. Now, when a person goes to a seed rack and you see all the different types of carrots and the different cucumbers and tomatoes and everything, it can be a little confusing. But now all the varieties aren't the same. There are varieties that have been specially tested and specially chosen for our northern growing areas because they're better suited to our climate and our growing season. And the things that the things that these vegetable varieties differ on are things such as the days to maturity. So a person can always read the directions, but another good spot to find the information is this production created by NDSU's Tom Kalb with Extension. Each year, he sends out trial seeds to people who sign up for his trials, and they test different types of vegetables. And then those tests are used to create a yearly recommended vegetable cultivar variety list. And so this is the new one for 2025. So to get this list, it's quite easy. Just simply do an online search, vegetable cultivars for North Dakota 2025. Vegetable cultivars for North Dakota 2025, and maybe add NDSU on there too for good measure. And this circular will pop up. It's not really available in print copy anymore for me to send to you, but you can find it online quite easily. And so that has all the latest recommendations for everything from string beans all the way down to zucchini and everything in between. So you might want to check that out. That's got a lot of good information on it as well. All right, the fifth important key is to um, understand that some vegetables are planted directly out into the soil, out in the garden soil from seeds. Others are from transplants. Now, of course, experienced gardeners, yeah, you've been doing this for many, many years, but for anyone new to gardening, this isn't always intuitive. For example, when you go to the seed rack, well, you see tomato seeds, a packet of tomato seeds, you see packs of pepper seed, and when it comes time to plant out in the garden, well, maybe you think, well, yeah, I seed my tomatoes out there. So anyway, it's important to understand that there are generally two different ways in which we plant vegetables out in the garden. Okay, some vegetables are planted from seed directly out into the soil because they don't require so much time to give you a crop. Other types of vegetables, we use transplants. Sometimes they're called starter plants. So either you grow your own from seed, starting indoors, or you go to the garden center and buy tomato plants and pepper plants. You do transplants. If you direct seeded those out into the soil, they just take so very long. So, for example, tomatoes, you might get a crop in October instead of August on those. So if we take a look at some of the types of vegetables that are direct seeded out into the garden, there are the things like radish, carrots, peas, beans, lettuce, beets, sweet corn. All of those and others too are seeded directly out into the garden soil. But from transplants, so that we get a quicker crop, tomato, pepper, the cabbage family, such as cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, um, and cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli. I'm forgetting one. And also, you can do some things from seed or transplants. For example, cucumbers. You can plant those seed directly out, or you can buy starter plants or start your own starter plants of cucumbers, squash, pumpkin, and melons. Now, if you notice the picture there of the tomato plants with a pencil pointing to, we're going to talk about tomatoes, kind of specifically towards the end. But if you notice where the pencil is pointing, when we go to transplant tomatoes out into the garden, we can sink them down fairly deeply, and they'll root all along the stem. So tomatoes, as we're going to discuss later, can be planted quite deeply. So, for people just getting into vegetable gardening, that's the concept. Some things we plant directly from seed, others we use transplants and plant those starter plants out into the garden. Oh, when do we start? When can we start? When can we plant the vegetable garden? You know, we always get itchy, especially on a day like today that was so warm. All right. One of the keys is to don't start too early. I never trust an early spring because more often than not, we'll have May frost. And so we can enjoy the nice days in March and April, but year in and year out, there are kind of just dates on which we can start gardening. And so by kind of following those dates year in, year out, we don't get fooled by an early spring frost. All right, because more often than not, we get frost during that first half of May. The 10-day window that I look at for planting most of my garden, also the flower beds and flower planters, is a 10-day window between about May 15th and May 25th. Because at that point, the soil has warmed up, so seeds sprout quicker and tomato plants that are set out take off better because the soil has had a chance to warm up. And by about May 15th to May 25th, we can kind of see what the 10-day forecast is looking like. You know, is it going to dip down in the 30s? So maybe I better wait a few days. But we kind of know at that point. And it seems like when I garden during that time period, May 15th, May 25th, it seems as things work out well. But the nice thing is we don't have to wait for everything until May 15th to 25th because vegetables are divided into cool crops versus warm crops. Okay, let's talk about each of those. The cool crops can be planted earlier. Okay, and the reason that the cool crops can be planted earlier is because they will germinate in chilly soil, so they can go in quite early. Also, they will usually tolerate a little bit of frost. So even if they sprout and start to grow and we get some frost, they're usually okay with that unless the temperatures really plunge. So that means that cool season crops, we could start oftentimes in end of April or so, maybe even the middle of April. So to satisfy our gardening itch, if we're anxious to get going, there are some cool season crops that we can start in April. Now, those are things like radish, onion, lettuce, spinach, peas, even potato, carrots, cabbage will take frost. And so, the cool season crops, we can start those early. Now, the warm season crops, those definitely need to wait until sometime after the middle of May, maybe even the end of May, because they need warm soil. For example, if you planted a tomato plant early, such as end of April, even if we don't get any air frosts after that, and some years we don't get frost after the end of April, but if that soil is still chilly, that tomato plant can sit there and languish and be irreversibly damaged in that chilly soil. The soil temperature for these warm season crops needs to be 50 to 55 degrees or above. And so that oftentimes does not happen until middle of May to the end of May. So you can actually harm your tomato plants by setting them out in chilly soil. So warm season crops, they need warm soil in order to start their root growth. And they also are killed right about at 32 degrees. It doesn't take much of a frost, even tickling kind of right around 32 degrees, and they can be irreversibly damaged. So warm season crops include tomato, pepper, eggplant, cucumber, melons, squash, zucchini, the summer type squash as well. So understanding the difference between cool season crops and warm season crops is important. All right, some of the basic tools needed. A spading fork works excellent. That's what I use to dig our potatoes and carrots, but also for a raised bed, that can kind of help to turn the soil. A rake, a kind of a bow type garden rake works well for kind of leveling the soil. And also when you plant seeds, a person can use the rake to pull some soil over the row of seeds. Also a garden hoe. Now the type of hoe that you see pictured there is really for making furrows to plant seeds down in a furrow, or also for digging the hole in which you'd plant a tomato plant, or plant a piece of seed potato. A weeding hoe is a little different. I don't have a picture of that, but a weeding hoe is best very thin. See, we don't need to pull up a whole big chunk of soil when we weed. A very thin hoe that will just slice through the surface is much more usable for weeding. Now, a rototiller isn't absolutely necessary for a larger garden. That works great. They can also be rented at the rental shops. Um, Other tools that are very handy, stake and twine. And of course, you can reuse those every year. Stake and twine helps to mark out the row, and also a yardstick, so that we, or tape measure, something like that, that we can measure the distance in between rows of plants and between plants within a row as well. All right, how do you get rid of grass for a new garden? What if you're just starting into a new garden, but you've got grass there in the back? Well, there are a couple of ways. You can dig it out. If you get the grass plus the root area, it usually will not grow back as long as you get all of that. You can do that. The other thing you can do is smother, either with cardboard overlapped or black plastic covered over the area. Now, if a person starts that when the grass is starting to green in the springtime, it takes a while for that smothering concept to work. If, for example, a person can't put down that smothering layer the end of April, and it might not be totally dead by the end of May. It might, but some of the grass could grow back. So really, the smothering technique, you would need to really prepare about the season ahead, the year ahead. Because I really do think that for smothering it would take the better share of May and June, which would make your gardening kind of late. But that's an option. Or another option is glyphosate. But of course, that is controversial. Some people are very opposed to glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in original Roundup. Um, but it is an option for killing the grass. Glyphosate has been shown to not have soil carryover. It's deactivated by soil. And so it can be applied to kill the grass and then taken off. And of course, all precautions need to be taken when applying any chemicals. So anyway, there are options to getting rid of the grass. We're going to talk about if you do raised gardens in a minute as to whether you need to get rid of the grass, but you don't really. Okay, number 9, make straight rows. So if you have an in-ground garden, straight rows are nice because then when you go to Well, I'm German. I like everything in nice, neat, straight rows. But besides that, it does make weeding easier. If everything is kind of in a line, you can see where it is. So to make straight rows, you mark one end of the row with a stake and twine, and then down to the other end of the row, insert your stake, and then you've got a nice, neat row in which you can pull along the hoe using that string or twine as a guide, and that will make a nice neat furrow. And then you go along and plant your seeds. Now, very fine little tiny seeds, like that package of carrot seed. Gosh, if it's a breezy day, the seed can just blow out between the time you shake it out of the seed packet and between the time it gets down into that little furrow, it can blow away. What I kind of like to do is empty the seed pack in the palm of my hand, and then use the other hand, the fingers, to gently kind of space out the seeds. It seems when I try to shake them out of the packet, sometimes if I'm not careful, it'll all dump out in one big glob. So that's why I just personally kind of like to empty it in my hand, and then use my fingers to distribute the seed, especially for large seeds such as pea seed that get spaced out. We can space them quite nicely within a row like that. The packet will tell about the depth of them, and so many of the very tiny seeds are only planted about a quarter of an inch, which is barely covering them. Larger seeds, such as peas, beans, corn, are more like an inch or so deep. And also, the packet will tell about how far apart the final spacing would be. See, if they get too crowded, such as the carrots, we need to thin them afterwards. So once you get the seed distributed, then pull the soil back into the trench, whether the trench is a little deeper or a little shallower. Pull it back, the soil back in with either a hoe or a rake. Then, once you got that row seeded, put in a stake at either end, a label, and then move your string and stake to the next row, and then on you go. Now, another pointer that I've just found really helpful is okay, we label the row as you go, like with some little wooden stakes or milk jugs, plastic milk jugs cut up into, kind of 8 or 10 inch long pieces, something to mark each row, because if you know where that vegetable is going to emerge, then if the weeds start coming up first, you can do a lot of in between the row weeding or hoeing if you know where that vegetable is supposed to be emerging. And I also like to put a label, a stake, on each end of that row. So that I know from one end to the other where that row is supposed to be appearing. When I don't do both ends, sometimes when weeds and everything are coming up all in a mix, I can't quite see where the opposite end of that row is. And so I've just found it helpful myself to label each end of the row with a stake to let me know where that is. Another hint is to, with warm season crops, use clear plastic mulch. Now, this was based on research done in the 1960s and 1970s at NDSU for how to get melons, muskmelon and watermelon, to ripen earlier so that farmers market people could get a crop and sell in North Dakota. So what they found with doing experiments on different colored mulches, that clear plastic mulch laid down, this is in our own garden, clear plastic mulch laid down. I go to the farm supply store and buy it in rolls. 4 to 6 mil is important. The very thin 2 mil is just too flimsy. But what you do is you go along, dig a trench I dig it about 3 feet wide, dig a trench, and then roll out plastic in between those. And you do this before you plant. Roll that out, and then bring soil in. I hope I'm describing this in a way it can be understood. Then bring soil in to cover the edges. Okay, as you kind of see there, the edges are all down in the soil. Then, when you plant the plants that you've started, melons and muskmelons, watermelon, can be started about May 1st. They grow quickly. So start them about May 1st in little pots for transplanting out sometime the maybe third or fourth week in May. So what you do is you've got the plastic all down, weighted down. You make a little X in the plastic, plant your little starter plant down in, weight weight the cut surface of the plastic down around the plants so the wind doesn't get under, and water gets in right around each plant, and it also seeps in from outside the plastic. It does a beautiful job. You can kind of see the moisture accumulating underneath. It controls the weeds. Some weeds might sprout, but they're very quickly solarized or fried off under that plastic. The plastic does a delightful job of warming up that soil just like a greenhouse on the soil. And that's what many of these warm season crops need. You could do this with tomatoes. You can do it with cucumbers, squash, zucchini. Those tend to give you a pretty good crop anyway, so you don't need to use clear plastic. But boy, melons seem to be such a long season crop. So melons, it really works well with. But again, to get some earlier tomatoes, you could do a few tomatoes with this technique as well. And so anyway, it really does work quite nicely to speed along warm season crops. Oh, I was going to mention too, a person might wonder, well, wouldn't black plastic warm up the soil even better? Well, when black plastic is tested and rolled out on the soil, if you on a sunny day, if you hold your hand on that black plastic, it is nice and warm on that surface. But when you slide your hand underneath the black plastic and feel the soil is still cool. The black plastic does not allow the sun to penetrate down on through like clear plastic. Clear plastic makes a greenhouse over the soil, allowing that warm sunshine to penetrate down through into the root zone. Ah, there's a watermelon that we grew in our garden. So that really does work well. If you'd like to get melons and get them to ripen earlier, that's a fun process to try. You can even put the clear plastic down sometime maybe even early May. Get that soil underneath warming up nicely, even though you're not going to plant the plants into it until towards the end of May. All right, number 12 is to recognize the difference in flower types. Okay, now this maybe seems a little odd why I'm bringing this up, but each year I get questions as to how come my cucumbers are flowering, but they're not producing any little cucumbers? I don't see anything happening. Well, that's because in crops such as squash or pumpkin pictured here, and also cucumbers and melons, on a on those plants, there are two different types of flowers. The petals, the big bright petals might look the same, but some of those are male flowers, some are female. On the left photo there is the female of a pumpkin. And so if you see at the base of the yellow part of the flower, there's a little miniature pumpkin. On the right-hand side is the male blossom. You know, the petals look about the same, yellow, but notice that at the base, it does not have that little miniature pumpkin. So the bees do the work of spreading the pollen from the male blossom over into the female blossom. And then when the pollination occurs, then that little miniature pumpkin goes on to create a big pumpkin. The male blossom, on the other hand, just falls off. The interesting thing is, early in the season, the first blossoms that form are the male blossoms. So the first blossoms produced on those cucumber plants are oftentimes just male blossoms. Eventually, the female blossoms catch up and they'll be starting to produce too, and then you get a crop of cucumbers. So if kind of early in the season, the first blossoms being formed, and we're all excited that good, I'm gonna get little cucumbers pretty quick, but nothing's happening. Well, take a look and see. So if there's no little miniature cucumber at the base of the blossom, then those are all just all male. And so nothing to worry about. The females blossoms will catch up. So there's likely nothing wrong with your cucumber plants. So anyway, it's a fascinating part of nature that on that family of crops, there are separate male and female. So this year out in the garden, check your squash, pumpkin, and cucumbers, and it's interesting to note the difference. Oh, this one's a big one. Wouldn't life be easier if there were no weeds in the vegetable garden? Wouldn't life be much easier? At least I know mine would. So in the vegetable garden, there are no magic chemicals that will just make the vegetables grow and no weeds. There are no there are no products like that. The pre-emergent product they've probably seen on garden center shelves called preen, Preen. Should add a picture of that here. That can be used around some vegetables, but a person needs to look at the label. But generally, there's not a chemical that somehow makes all our weed problem disappear in the vegetable garden. So that means we should hoe or pull when weeds are just barely visible. So if you notice there, the person is hoeing with kind of a scuffle type hoe that just goes along this kind of the surface. But when the little weeds are just barely sprouting, it's such a feeling of accomplishment to go along and nip those in the bud before they get away. There's nothing more discouraging than if weeds get 2, 3, 4 inches tall and you can't hoe them out any longer and you can't tell where the vegetables are because the weeds are just as tall. And so early weeding is very, very important. And as is mulching. Mulch can be a great savior in the vegetable garden because if we know where our rows are, or after the vegetables emerge in the row, we can go along and we can mulch. Clean straw, we could use lawn clippings as long as they have not been treated with herbicide. Um, if your yard has been treated with herbicide, it needs to be mowed at least 3 times, those disposed of, and then you could start collecting the clippings to dry and use as a mulch. A person can use a variety of other products for mulching too in the vegetable garden. And also, it's important never to let weeds go to seed because weed seed can survive in the garden for decades. In fact, it's interesting. Purslane, which is that low-growing weed, loves heat, loves dryness. It just spreads outward. And one purslane plant, just one, can produce several 100,000 seeds. And when the seed capsules pop, they can shoot their seeds from at a distance of 25 to 40 feet. And the seeds can remain viable in the soil for 25 to 30 years. So one purslane plant. Um, I realize some people enjoy eating purslane. That's a separate issue. But if you don't want your garden to be covered with purslane, just one escaped purslane plant can populate your garden for many decades. So the importance is to try not to let the weeds go to seed, because if we prevent them from going seed to seed, eventually our weeding can become less and less the more that you garden that plot. Okay, next let's kind of switch a little bit to planting a raised bed or small space garden. Now, all of everything that we mentioned today, up to this point, those same things apply to a raised bed garden. But there are certain different techniques we can use for a raised bed or small space garden. All right, let's start. So now the most usable width of a raised garden, a raised bed, is about 4 feet. So if we create these raised beds in units of 4 feet, okay, now the reason for 4 feet is that's the comfortable distance that you can reach in from either side. If you need to garden just from the one side, for example, if you're putting the raised bed up against a fence or something, you can't get to that back side. 4 foot could be a little bit of a stretch, but generally 4 feet. So you can go 4 feet by 4 feet or 4 feet by 8 feet, 4 feet, whatever. You can do multiples of these. But anyway, 4 feet has been kind of the key thing. And also, a standard lumber is multiples of 4 feet. A 2x4 comes in 8 feet, 12 feet, 16, etc. So it's a handy unit of measurement with which to work. Now, in raised bed gardening, there's been a fascinating concept that was introduced by a gentleman by the name of Mel Bartholomew several decades ago already, and it's called the square foot gardening method. Now, you can easily do an online search, square foot gardening method, and you'll get lots of wonderful information. And that concept is how to get the best maximum production out of a square foot gardening, such as 4 foot by 4 foot, 4 foot by 8, etc. But I'm going to quickly introduce that topic a little bit in just a minute. Okay, first of all, what mix are we going to fill our raised garden with? Before I get to the mix, I should mention, okay, if you're going to put that raised bed garden out on a lawn area, you don't need to kill off the grass with either chemical, or you don't need to dig it out. But you should lay something down that's going to smother that grass, that's going to kill it. I like cardboard for that reason. Um, Weed fabric could be used, but that's not going to really disintegrate. I'd rather have that product underneath, smother the grass, and then eventually disintegrate, which cardboard will do. So we put down uh, our um, our garden, our raised bed garden. We set that down on the grass, and then in the bottom of that, next to the grass, uh, line that bottom overlapped well with cardboard, and then put in your mix. Now, what depth of raised garden should it be? Now, really, I think the best, most usable would be at least 12 inches, such as creating them out of a 2x12 lumber, or which is actually what, only maybe 11 inches wide. So 2x12 or a 1x12. A 1x10 inch might be okay too, or 2x10, but getting a little extra depth certainly wouldn't hurt. So that's kind of the depth. Next, we need to fill it with a mix. Now, there are special mixes sold for raised bed gardens. Miracle Grow has one called Raised Bed Soil. There's another one called Raised Bed Mix that's an organic. The Sun Grow Company has a special one, Raised Bed Mix. So the garden centers and national chains do sell mixes specially for this. Now, if we dug up out of the corner of a yard, or went to a farm field and just dug up some soil and brought it in and filled your raised bed, it packs too much. The best field soil that would grow wheat just perfectly, once that gets in a raised garden, it just packs too greatly. Same with anything out of maybe an in-ground vegetable garden. If that is dug out of there and put in a raised garden, it just really does pack too much. On the other hand, some of these raised bed mixes almost are too light. They're the opposite of getting too heavy and packing. They're almost too light, and you're constantly watering them. So what has been found to be a good mix is to use these raised bed mixes, but also add a little bit of regular soil to them. And what do I mean by a little bit? I don't, maybe a third of actual soil, maybe even up to a half of regular soil. Now, if you don't want to dig up a corner of the backyard for that soil, there are bags of actual garden soil that are sold. So if you just check for, like, Miracle Grow has garden soil, so it's the heavy type of soil, and so blending the mix like that does seem to work quite well. All right. Now, I mentioned the square foot method of raised bed gardening. It's actually pretty awesome. So as you see in the picture here, the bed, again, it's 4 foot by, and I'm not sure, let's see, 1, 2, 3, it looks like they've done, is that 6 or 8, maybe 6. So anyway, 4 feet by, they've gone 6, it could go 8. But notice that it's been divided by strings into 1-foot sections. Okay, for example, on the 4-foot width, you've got 4 1 square sections, right? 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. There's your 4 feet. And on the opposite length, I think it looks like this is 6. So you've got 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. Okay, so you see you've measured, marked it off at 1 foot intervals in both directions, stretched a string across, and you've created a grid. So if this is a 4 foot by 6 foot, I've got 24 grids, 24 spaces. If it was an 8 foot long, I'd have 4 times 8. I'd have 32. I've had a grid. I would have a grid with 32 spaces. Now, the square foot gardening concept tells you that in each of those spaces, those 1 foot spaces, in each of those spaces, there's a certain amount of vegetables that have been shown to produce well in that. Okay, for example, beets on this chart. And again, this chart is available like online. Just search square foot gardening method. You'll come up with charts like this. Beets. We've got 9 beets can be grown in that 1 foot square section. Carrots, you can maybe get, I don't know, there are 15 or so carrots. Look at tomatoes. One tomato plant is going to take at least that 1 foot square section. And that's if it's trained up on a trellis. If you're not going to kind of train it up, you might need to devote one tomato plant occupying 4 of those squares. Okay, radishes, you can get quite a few radishes there in one of those square foots. So you see the way that we optimize our raised bed garden by figuring out in each of those squares, what's the optimum amount of vegetables I can plant in there. So this is one very good option for getting the maximum amount of production out of a raised bed garden. Or there'd be nothing wrong too if you want to plant little rows of things, that works well too. But you might experiment with the raised bed square foot gardening method. Okay, next we're going to talk about planting garden in containers for patios and apartment dwellers, or maybe out on a deck. So for gardening in containers, look for seed packs that say grows well in containers, because there are some vegetable varieties that are specifically developed for that. For example, there are sweet corn varieties that can be grown in a tub. If you did a standard sweet corn variety in a tub, it might not produce very well because it needs more space. The string beans pictured there was a special variety that was developed for planters. And so check for that. Grows well in a container. All right, and use potting mix, not a regular soil. Containers need drainage holes, really 12-inch diameter or more. If you'd like to grow tomatoes in a container, the size of a 5-gallon bucket or larger is needed. And of course, drain holes drilled in the bottom. And potting mix needs to drain well, so spend a little more and get a good high quality potting mix. Now, in a raised garden or in a container, you don't need to replace the mix every year. You can keep using that same mix. We need to watch the fertilizer though on them. All right, how many plants do you put in a container? Well, this same square foot gardening method is a great resource. For example, I mentioned that each pot that you use for a container garden should be at least 12 inches or bigger. Okay, well, that 12-inch pot is about one of these squares of square foot gardening. So in a 12-inch pot, you could get, well, it says up to 32 radishes. I might be stretching it a bit, 16 carrots, but only one tomato or one pepper plant in those. All right. Succession planting. Tip number 17. Succession planting means some crops grow quickly. We harvest them quickly and we can plant another crop, such as radishes. Once they're harvested, you plant them early, harvest them, plant another. And carrots, that can be done. Spinach, lettuce, all can be done too. Now, the remaining tips are on America's #1 homegrown vegetable, and that's definitely the tomato. So it's important to understand that tomatoes, there are two different classes of tomatoes based on how they grow. Now, the determinant tomatoes are the type that have more of a bush habit. They're also more container friendly, but they tend to consolidate their crop on a less viney plant. Those are the determinant. And the tag will usually mention determinate or indeterminate. Determinate types generally don't need staking. The indeterminate varieties grow much more vining. The way I remember this is indeterminate grows indiscriminately. They just keep vining and vining and vining, and they really are best caged or staked. Otherwise, they occupy a big space in your garden. And both types can produce wonderful tomatoes. The other thing, very important when you're selecting tomato varieties, look at the days. Now, the days that are listed on tomato tag, that's from when you set out the transplants, the starter plants. That's when you plant them out until the average time for a first fruit. Now, it's going to depend on the heat of this spring and summer, et cetera. So you can't set your calendar. But it does allow us to rank these varieties into early, mid-season, or late. All right. So it's always fun to have a few early tomatoes. The early ripe tomatoes, 45 to 65 days, they'll give you some fruit first in the season. But for your main season tomatoes that you want for lots of slicing, lots of canning and salsa making, the best varieties to choose are about 68 to 72 days, maybe up to 75 days. Those are the main season, mid-season types. The late tomatoes, it's nice to have a few of those too, because generally they're bigger fruits, 75 to 100 days. But the reason this is important is if a person only has room for a couple of tomato plants and you choose one that says 85 days, you won't have tomatoes probably until September. Everyone else will be harvesting their mid-season tomatoes, and you'll be still waiting for your late one to ripen up. So those days are really, really important to watch. Now, one tomato I'm going to try is Burpee has a new one, and I'd have to check the name of it. Burpee has a couple of new tomato varieties that they say you can just take the seed, plant it directly out into the garden soil, which is totally opposed to really anything we've done for ages. You plant the tomato seed directly out into the vegetable garden, and they claim that it will catch up and pass and produce at least as early as when you use starter plants. But I'm going to try those and see if it works for us. Okay, a plant tag information. It'll say if it's determinate or indeterminate, disease resistance. The more alphabets that are on the tag, the better. That shows it's got more disease resistance. And so if you look on there somewhere, it'll tell the number of days. This one, it said Bonnie Centennial hybrid tomato. This one, 80 to 90 days. That's kind of a late one. And so it'd be fine to plant that one as a later one, but I want some earlier ones for my main season. Tomato plants love to be planted deeply because unlike many other vegetables, they will root from all along that buried stem. You might pick off that lower leaf that's getting kind of too far down in. Pick off the lower leaves, sink that tomato down, as my old professor used to say, sink it right up to its ears, and it won't whip in the wind as much. It'll root from along that buried stem, but tomatoes is about the only plant that we bury that deeply. Um, and it really works well. You can heat the soil, like we mentioned for melons. You can use clear plastic mulch, maybe not for all your tomatoes, but for a couple to coax along some earlier growth. Now, blossom end rot, that is a common question. So you see here what happens. Blossom end rot is not a disease caused by an organism. Instead, we could spend a whole hour on blossom end rot. What happens is the tomato plant can't take calcium up out of the soil, and so the so the plant sucks calcium out of the developing fruit, causing that sunken black area. So a person think, well, okay, well, let's just dump calcium onto the soil. Most of our soils already have plenty of calcium, but the reason that the roots can't access that calcium is because the moisture is fluctuating. Okay, and if we kind of think about it, roots have to drink in the nutrients, don't they? So the calcium has to be in a liquid solution. The calcium that's already in the soil, plentiful, has to be in a liquid solution for the roots to drink it on in. And that means the moisture has to be adequate. If the moisture is bouncing from dry to wet to back to dry, then those roots can't drink in the calcium and it causes blossom end rot. So anyway, adding Epsom salts doesn't work. That's been shown to, if a person uses Epsom salts, you've actually kind of lucked out because the research has shown that that can actually cause some problems. And so it doesn't really do anything to add tums to the soil and or eggshells because you see if those aren't liquefied, they still aren't going to work. So again, the bottom line is that most of our soils have plentiful calcium. We just need to keep the soil more moist uniformly. Good way to do that is to apply a mulch. It'll help keep that soil uniformly moist. But again, we could talk all evening on blossom end rot. Tip number 19, fertilize. We can use an all-purpose 10-10-10, or we can use organic type of fertilizers. If you're wondering about the nutrient content of soil, you can do a soil test. NDSU no longer has the soil testing lab, but just do an online search, University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab. University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab, and our sister university has a good website that you can mail in a soil sample. It's not overly expensive, and you'll get a nice report. And that'll tell you how much fertilizer you may or may not need. Now, upcoming is no-till vegetable gardening. I'm going to try more of this because right now I'm not. I'm a garden tiller, but I can see some points on no-till gardening. Tilling does tend to break down some of the soil structure, maybe making it hard packed in the long run. Tilling brings up weed seeds out of the base, so I'm hoeing more weeds. So in no-till gardening, the soil stays covered, more like nature intended. In nature, most soil is covered unless you're in a desert. And so keeping the soil covered is an important part of the no-till gardening. So how to start with no-till? Maybe the first season isn't going to work out the best, but it will get better. So you start by layering the garden surface with compost, leaves, shredded bark, material like that. A person can even use things such as cardboard weighted down so it isn't all blowing away. And in that way, each year your soil is going to get even better as you get into it. All right. So whether you're gardening in containers and getting radishes or raised bed type gardens, or whether you've got kind of the in-ground type, we can really get a lot of production out of a vegetable garden. And now let's turn to the questions. I'm going to first check the let's do the Q&A first here. Okay. And again, thank you for all of you. There were almost 150 of you that joined in. That's awesome. If any of you need to depart, I am going to send the recording of this out to all who were registered. And so I'll start answering the questions. I won't be offended if some of you do need to duck away. You will get the recording. All right. But thanks for staying tuned. All right, first question. I've been using row covers to keep little green worms off my lettuce, which works really well. But is there an easier way? No, row covers do work really, really well, such as even the cabbage family that are so prone to those terrible little cabbage worms, the green worms. And so row covers can keep the butterflies, the white moths, the caterpillar moths from laying eggs on the crop. So row covers do work very, very well. They let the light and moisture in and keep the insects out. Someone mentioned, what was the music playing prior to starting? I do have a playlist that is free of copyright, and at some point maybe I can send some of that to you, but it's a non-copyrighted music. Question, does glyphosate harm the roots of pine trees? Now, glyphosate, original Roundup, even though it's deactivated by soil, we need to be very, very cautious that it doesn't find its way and get translocated into other roots. For example, there is some research showing that, for example, if you killed okay, if weeds are growing under pine trees and you used glyphosate on that, that it goes down and kills those weeds. But if there are any of the pine tree roots touching the roots of the weeds, there's some indication there could be some translocation into those. So I guess I would be hesitant to use almost any chemical type on the weeds under pine trees. I'd maybe rather smother the weeds under pine trees. Um, so again, let me here also, let me advance to my email. Let me put my email up there. And so, for example, if you're wondering on weed control on pine trees, feel free to email me, donald.kinzler@ndsu.edu. I'll gladly give some other suggestions. If it's a whole row of farm type pine trees, um, but smothering under pine trees oftentimes works. Cardboard and then wood chip mulch laid on top of that. Next question, Kathy asks, can you save or reuse the clear plastic mulch the following year, or does it need to be replaced? It usually breaks down too much. What I've found is that by the time it gets covered over with the vines, so it has to stay in place, it's kind of locked in place, and by the end of the season, it's degraded. And a person, since the plastic does not break down naturally into the soil, a person does need to physically remove that plastic off the soil, but it's usually too brittle at that point to reuse. Okay, Diane asks, when used clear plastic, do weeds grow underneath? Some weeds will start and then they get solarized or burnt off underneath. So I've never had any problems. There are a few that might try to sneak up in the same opening that the the melon plant is coming up through. So you do have to watch right around the plant and just pull out anything that does try to escape through that. Denise asks, does it benefit the plant to pick off the male blossoms? Probably not, because the male blossoms, of course, are needed for pollination, so you wouldn't want to get rid of all the male blossoms. And I don't think removing a portion of them probably stimulates the formation of female blossoms. I think I'd probably just tend to let everything just happen naturally on that. That's a good question. Connie asks, are there weeds that need to be pulled up and out rather than using a hoe and leaving the weed on the soil? Yes. I mentioned purslane, and again, some people enjoy eating purslane. Um, but purslane, for one thing, if you leave it lay, okay, you hoe it up, but if you leave it lay, it re-roots. It can almost even, okay, I've even tried flipping it on its back with the roots in the air, and sometimes it's found its way to just re-root. And so, um, certainly if the weeds have gone to seed, pick them up, dispose carefully so you aren't spreading the seed. If it's any weeds such as thistles or anything that you're digging up the roots that could re-root, definitely take those away. If it's a weed that hasn't gone to seed, for example, red root pigweed, if it hasn't gone to seed, you can just lay that on the surface, let the sun kind of kill it, and it will add some organic matter. But purslane is one of the ones that just re-roots so easily, and so they should be taken off. Um, Emily asked, the year before last, I had a terrible squash bug infestation in my vegetable garden. I was horrified last year that I used pesticides. What are your thoughts on controlling the pest? Okay, a squash bug, there are a couple of different things that will affect squash bug. One is the little striped yellow and black cucumber beetle, and that can cause plants to wilt. And so insecticides can be used, or maybe possibly should be used on that. The other one is the squash vine borer, that the adult borer moth lays an egg in the lower 18 inches or so of squash vine stem. The egg hatches into a larvae that goes into the squash vine and tunnels around in there, and all of a sudden the squash vines just collapse. It looks like the squash vines are dry, but you water them and they don't recover. And so the squash vine borer, at a certain point in June, when you can still kind of see the lower 18 inches, a person can apply um, kind of an all-purpose vegetable insecticide, such as 7 or 8. Both of those are quite broad spectrum, and you carefully apply it to the lower 18 inches from about ground level on up to about 18 inches where that moth would be laying those eggs. And so we keep it away from the flowering portion so we don't harm our pollinating insects. And some people have even wrapped like aluminum foil over that lower area. So the squash bug is probably one of the two things I'm thinking. Um, and a person can also check out spinosad, spinosad, Spinosad. It's an organic insecticide, but of course, some of the organic products can also affect bees, so we need to use caution. Okay, Diane asks, when building a raised barn, what kind of lumber do you recommend? That's an excellent question because we don't want it all to rot in a couple of years. The wonderful thing is that today's treated lumber, excuse me, today's treated lumber is food safe. The old green treated lumber had compounds that were not food safe. So everything that you can buy currently at the lumber yard that's treated, usually it's brown treated, and that is safe to use for vegetable gardens. Don't use old railroad ties that have creosote and damaging type things such as that. Um, or there are kind of ready-made raised bed gardens that are of non-rotting type materials. Cedar lumber would work, but it's really expensive. But anyway, treated lumber, today's treated lumber is safe. Does it help to soak large seeds before planting? Some of the hard seeds, such as peas are kind of a hard seed, and so that does seem to benefit from soaking overnight. Most of the other large seeds seem to sprout quite well on their own. Mary asks, where do you find seeds or plants for FM tomato Tanatico? I've been asked this question before. This was an All-America winner that was listed, and I listed it in my garden columns. Tonatico, Tonatico. It sounds like a wonderful tomato. I even inquired, because none of us could find seed, I inquired from the All-America selection people, where can we get seed? Because normally the things that they promote you can get. That's kind of the object of it. And so they said they would check, but they didn't get back to me, which indicates to me that we're going to have to wait a while for the F1 tomato Tanatico. Where can you get pure straw? Carmen asks. Okay, good question. Pure straw that doesn't have well, two things. So it doesn't have a lot of grain seed in that will sprout up and kind of be weed-like in a garden. And the other thing, of course, is some of the some of the herbicides that are used in farm fields and grain production, some of those can carry into the straw and can damage the vegetable crops because of that herbicide carryover. And so a person might check for certain if that straw is from an organic production. We used to not have to think about things like straw. As I was growing up, we used straw all the time out of the barn on the straw bales that were taken to the barn. We used those all the time on the garden. But now, with increased use of some of the herbicides that weren't available then, some of those herbicides have a longer carryover, and that do carry over into straw. Carla asked, how do you keep mulch from blowing away? Well, that's a good question, especially if you use something such as cardboard. That really has to be weighted down. And the other mulches, such as dried grass or straw, some of those have to almost be kept moist a little bit. And once they kind of become a little bit moist, they're less apt to blow. For example, grass clippings, once they kind of get glued down to the soil a little bit with the moisture, then they seem not to blow. But in our wind, that's certainly a situation. Nina asks, what causes powdery mildew and how do you get rid of it? Powdery mildew is a fungus, a fungal disease that creates a white coating that can happen on cucumbers, squash, pumpkin, melons, pea vines, quite common, that gray powdery mildew. And once that forms, no amount of washing off will get rid of that. And powdery mildew can cause the collapse and drying of the vines, so it can be quite serious. A couple of things you can do to prevent. When you do water, water only the soil. Try not to get the leaves wet because the moisture can splash around the fungus that causes powdery mildew. And also, if you're consistently troubled with it, look for an all-purpose garden fungicide, that lists powdery mildew. And you apply that while the leaves are still free of the disease or at the very earliest sign of that. Laura asks, what thickness of clear plastic works well, not too flimsy? She missed what I mentioned. 4 or 6 mil. So I go to the farm supply store that has boxes of clear plastic, and it's maybe in a wider roll than what I need, but I just cut it to about a 4 foot wide. And then by the time I cover it, it gives about a 3 foot. So check the farm supply store for 4 or 6 mil. A box of that plastic might last you several years. Sharon asks, I noticed some red plastic under some tomatoes on one of the pictures. How effective is that and what does it do? You've maybe noticed red plastic mulch being sold, and there's some indication that the red will bounce radiation off of the red and onto the tomato plant and give better production. The results, I think, have been marginal. So to be honest, I don't think I'd maybe invest in red plastic. It does, I think, let some light through too, so does give some warming effect. It might be worth a try, but I don't think it would be quite as dramatic. It has been tested. Laura asked, a former pines and maple trees on a future garden site is the best way to remove tree roots underground so plants do well. So on a pine tree, any evergreen tree, actually the needles do not make the soil incompatible for vegetable gardening. The reason why nothing much grows under an evergreen is because the roots of an evergreen are so very, very shallow and they take all the moisture and the nutrients and don't leave much for whatever else you try to plant under that. But once the evergreen is taken out, and the nice thing is the roots are kind of shallow, and they're going to decay fairly rapidly and just take away any excess needles that might be on the surface. But they did not poison or make it too acid at all. And so once that the pine or the maple, once that the stump is taken out, it'll probably take a while for the roots underground to decay, but they're going to turn into just fine compost. So the first year, as those roots are decomposing, the little bacteria and fungi that do the decomposing might be using a little extra of your fertilizer, your nitrogen. So make sure that you're fertilizing, especially the first season or two on that. Sybil asks, how can we deter stem borer in our backyard for zucchini? Yes, the squash vine stem borer, like I mentioned. Make sure to treat the lower from soil level on up about 18 inches on the squash or zucchini stem with an insecticide, beginning in probably the third week in June. All right, how to prevent powdery mildew? Yep, we talked about that. Larry asked, when the temperature for tomato plants gets too hot, they do not produce tomatoes. So are there any other plants that do not produce fruit or vegetables when it gets too warm outside? That's a great question, Larry. So the warm season type crops that we mentioned, pepper, tomato, eggplant, All the melons, squash, they love it warm. But there's an upper threshold, which is about 90 degrees or so. Once the temperature hits 90 and above, then they actually start to taper off growth a little bit. Temperatures too high can affect the pollen. The pollen might not be as good that day. The little bees might not be in the mood to fly around in the heat. And also, the fruit formation doesn't happen as much when we get extended heat like that. So they're warm loving up to a certain point. So all of the heat-loving things can be affected if it gets too warm, and generally too many days above 90 is kind of that threshold. Larry also asked, what about using coffee grounds in the soil? Coffee grounds are a great organic material, and they aren't too acid. Most of our soils are generally on the alkaline side, so they could use a little acidifying. And most of the acid is already drunk by us in our coffee. And so coffee grounds are a wonderful, wonderful source of organic material. As an indeterminate tomato grows out of its cage, would you recommend pinching the main leader? Yes. Pruning of indeterminate tomatoes. So do a little quick online search, how to prune a tomato. And you can pinch out the main leader. Also, instead of letting multiple vining shoots happen as the tomato plant is forming, you leave one or two main leaders coming up and pinch out the side shoots. Plastic boards for garden beds. Yep, the plastic boards for garden beds seem to be a good safe. There's a lot of studying being done about what's the term? Micro cells coming off of plastic and into things. But that research is kind of new. So whether or not plastic emits things into the garden, we don't know for sure yet. Right now, plastic in garden is being declared safe. I don't know what the results will be if they actually start analyzing some things, but plastic boards right now are certainly recommended. Would a metal water tank work for a raised garden? Yes. Got some wonderful friends growing vegetables in a water tank. Wonderful, wonderful depth. Larry mentions for squash plants, would a sticky tree compound around the plant stem help to protect from the squash spore? I think it would. I don't know that the sticky compound called tanglefoot, I'm not sure that that's been tested on squash vines because that's really, really sticky. I'm not sure if a syrupy type material, I've never heard of that, Larry, being used, might be worth a try. If a syrupy type material would stay sticky enough, it probably would catch the adult borer moth before they can lay many eggs. Might be worth a try if there's a kind of a plant-friendly sticky substance. Carmen asks, which plants are best watered at the root versus on top of the plant? Almost all of the vegetables would rather have their soil moistened, such as with soaker hose, rather than on top. Okay, a person might think, yeah, but rain comes up on top. And yep, that's good. Except when we get rain too frequent and too common, even Mother Nature's rains causes plant disease. We saw that last early summer, late spring, early summer, when it just didn't stop raining. It was a banner year for apple scab disease on flowering ornamental crabs. So even Mother Nature, if the leaves get wet too often, can cause diseases. So since we're going to get natural rain, when it happens, and that's wonderful, but we don't want to cause increased wetting of leaves by our sprinkling. So it's almost always better to only water the soil if you can. Sometimes there's no choice, but if you can, almost all plants are better having just the soils watered with soaker hoses or other means. Jane asks, can we use grass clippings around tomatoes, peppers when fresh, or is it necessary to let clippings dry first? Letting them dry first is kind of a good idea, and turning them so they don't kind of mold in the pile. And so letting them dry a little is good. I know some wonderful gardeners who kind of spread it out even relatively soon, day or two after mowing, and that seems to work good too. Again, the main thing is that they're not treated with lawn herbicides. Denise asks, I use farm water stock tanks for raised bed. Is the end cap drain hole enough for adequate drainage, or drill more holes in the floor of the tank? I think I'd probably opt for adding a couple extra holes in the bottom, just in case we get a 3-inch rain. It would probably be good, some drain holes in the bottom, or at least the lower, if you're never going to put water in it again, um, at the lower surface. Um, Maybe instead of the flat on the ground where, underneath, flat on the tank, the underside of the tank, I guess I'm trying to say, but maybe on the lower sides, right where the side meets the ground. So just a hair above ground level to drill some holes. Connie asks, is it beneficial to add crushed eggshells to the garden? Eggshells are a wonderful addition. Again, they're not going to cure the blossom end rot on tomatoes, but eggshells are a great product to add. What are your thoughts on using black landscape fabric in the whole garden and putting holes in for the seeds or plants to keep out the weeds? Yes, there are some excellent gardeners using black landscape fabric as a mulch, and then using it kind of in between the rows. And then they sometimes use that, pull up the fabric, use it for future years. And so landscape fabric can be used on gardening. Is wood ash a good soil additive? Wood ash can be used in limited quantities. The reason for that is it's fairly alkaline. It does have some potassium for fertilizer benefit, maybe a little nitrogen, but wood ash is quite high in alkaline type materials. And so how much would be safe? Not more than an inch distributed over. So if you've got a fire pit or somewhere, just kind of spread it out, an inch or less. Could add benefit, but we wouldn't want to get too much in that we would affect the alkalinity of the soil. Larry asked another question on spraying apple trees in the spring for where the leaves curl up and turn brown. So on apple trees, to prevent some of the foliage type diseases, I think an all-purpose home orchard spray. Sometimes they're called fruit tree sprays at the garden center. And when you look at the label, they have both an insecticide component and a fungicide component. So one product then can be used, and check the label for timing on that for diseases and insects. But one product then can help control both on that. Okay, let's check a few of the let's see, the chat questions. Do you recommend watering daily? Usually not. Um, Unless it's in a container, then you might need to water every day. But generally, we want to water. The preferred is on most gardens, probably raised bed garden too, and in-ground garden. If we got an inch of rain a week, we really wouldn't need to supplement any watering. So that's kind of the key, is providing about an inch of water per week. In a raised bed, you might need to do a little more often than that, depending on the soil type. How do you know when you've put on an inch of water? I like the tuna can or any other straight-sided can. Setting that out in the sprinkling zone, and then lets you know a tuna can is about 1 inch. So now I mentioned that sprinkling above isn't the preferred. But sometimes we don't have any choice, and tuna can will help catch that. If you're not watering above and you're using soaker hoses, how do you know then when, how do you know when you've applied an inch? Well, that's where you kind of almost have to use some experience. I don't know how you can gauge how much water is going out through soaker hoses, but just kind of dig down and make sure your watering is soaking down at least beyond 6 inches. If you're moistening the top 6 inches, and 1 inch of moisture will usually go down at least 6 inches, depending on soil type. But check down what's going, and maybe then you can gauge how long do I have to run my soaker hose so I'm getting it down 6 inches and not just on the top inch or so. Um, a note on weed control. I've had good luck using landscape fabric over my gardening and planting in sleds. Good. Thank you, Roger. Thanks for the note. So Roger's using that with good success, the landscape fabric. Now, let me check one last time here. I think we've answered all the questions that I've found. So again, thank you all very much. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you. Next week's webinar on Monday evening, same time, same spot, is on how to have a healthier lawn with less work and less inputs, and how to have things do well with less moisture, less chemicals, and yet we want a nice healthy lawn. And I will send that registration link to everyone who registered for tonight's webinar as well. And so thank you very much. Thanks for joining me, and have a very good week.